Okay, so this is our reference, and it's a relatively straightforward subject. Got this big hump here going smaller, and I'm going to change my cloud so they're coming in, bigger cloud here and smaller moving this way, and that will balance this shape. I think the horizon's in a good place, and I'll probably put in one more boat in the distance here. Two boats can look a little bit boring. All right, so let's have a look at our drawing. Just to stop the paper from sliding around, I'm going to put a piece of tape up here. And I'll lift that in a minute. So the sky is our biggest shape, the water's the next big shape, and then the hills after that are the next one. So if we probably come down to about 3, maybe 3 centimeters from the middle. There we go. So that's a horizon line. Do a double check with your pencil that it is horizontal. Here, this has come down a bit too much. I mean, a little undulation isn't going to be a problem. And then let's draw in these hills. Got a little one here. Then we've got the main hill going up, down like a real roller coaster, this. It's too high. If you put a line and it's in the wrong place, don't immediately rub it out. Leave it there and then draw in the correct shape. There we go. There's still a little hill I've got to put in here. This horizon line is absolutely critical, so keep that in mind, and then you just draw your shapes relative to that. This cabin is just above horizon. There we go. A lot more complex than I originally had intended. And then this boat, I'm going to move it about here. I'll just hint at some portholes there. Okay, and then I'm going to put another boat maybe here. So we'll just draw the hull, cabin. Doesn't have to be anything too fancy. And then the mast is usually towards the front of the sailboat. And I use as just a guide, if I look at the length of the boat, I make my mast about 1.5 times that. This one's a bit short, so I'm going to make that a bit bigger. Come back here. Make that a little bit bigger too. I don't know the science about sailing boats, but that's just what I've observed. If you make the mast about 1.5 times, it looks fine. Because everything's in silhouette, I don't have to worry too much about lightening these pencil marks. Maybe in the areas where there'll be a little bit of a highlight. And maybe this hill. First step, wet the back. Okay, now let's look at our colours. Here we're going to have cobalt blue. I'll add just a hint of warmth with some very weak cad orange, Winsor Newton cad orange, and Winsor Newton permanent rose. And that will give us our sky colour. And I'm going to mix a lot of this sky colour. Reason for that is whatever I don't use for the sky, I will use for the water. So none of that's going to go to waste. Cobalt blue. Other than the glitter, the sky is the lightest part of our painting. Maybe just a fraction more paint. So there's our cobalt blue. Very weak permanent rose. It's the middle of the day, you're not going to get a lot of colour in these clouds. And then some very weak, clean cad orange. Now that looks a lot stronger than what it actually is. So when you test it on the paper, see, that's the strength I've mixed. Same with the red. Barely tinting the paper. Okay. Because the sky is almost directly overhead, we're going to end up with a graded wash going from stronger tones to lighter tones. Remember, I want to create this cloud here. painting right through the hills. I'm going to have a small cloud somewhere there. So I'm just very lightly, dragging the brush, and these few little hairs that are sticking to the paper is what is going to create the lovely broken edge on of the cloud. Let's paint through that hill there. And up here, just fill that in. Quick brush strokes, lots of paint in my brush here so that the paint flows down the paper. That'll do. Then I'm going to pick up lots of water and just dilute that. In fact, I'll add a bit of water here just to lighten this passage so I get more of a graded wash coming down the paper. That'll do. Run this down. Now see how I'm holding the brush here? That allows me to paint a very straight line. There we go. Now before that dries, clean my brush. I'm going to add just a bit more permanent rose to that. Maybe a bit too much. There we go. And straight into the orange. Winsor Newton Cat Orange is a yellowish orange. You don't want a very reddish orange. It won't look right unless you're painting a sunset scene or something like that. Let's just throw a little bit more soft cloud there. Then I'll get some of this blue and just go into some parts of this cloud to give them a bit more shape. For instance, if we look at the reference, you can see how there's some darker areas here. Almost can't even tell where the cloud and the sky merge. And a little bit there. Now, so notice I painted through the hills. That way, when I paint the next layer to create the hills themselves, you won't risk getting like a little outline. If I just painted just to the top of the hills, then painted the hill themselves later, wet on dry, where the sky and the hill overlap, you quite often get a darker edge there, which we don't want to do. While that's drying, I'm going to work on the water. So we've got all this paint here, and all this cobalt blue wash. And for the water, I'm going to darken that with some French ultramarine. So the water's quite a bit darker than the sky, but not as dark as the hill. So I added some French ultramarine to that, and then we'll grey it off with some burnt sienna. So there's the sky colour. This is the water colour, the colour of the water. And this is probably okay for the distance, and then as I come forward, I'll add more paint into it. I don't have a lot of paint in my brush. And I also want a lot of light in the distance. In fact, I'll take my towel and tap the brush on that to take even more water out. And my little pinky finger is just resting on the paper to help control how much I touch the paper. Paint through the boats. It's too hard to paint around them at this stage. Got a little bit more paint. Tap it on the towel again. It's worth giving some thought to where you want the glitter to go. In our photo, we've got a band coming across here. So let's work on that. It's a good exercise to learn how to put the glitter where you want it. In fact, what I'm going to do, because I don't like anything dragging the eye into this area, instead of having the glitter coming in from here, let's get rid of that and we'll create some glitter coming across this way. And I've got to break up some of these really sharp, straight edges because it doesn't look right. We can have the odd bit of glitter here. Now, I'm going to get some water and mix a thicker mixture of this, mainly French ultramarine and burnt sienna. There's just a hint of green to the water too, so I'll add a small amount of cobalt turquoise. And it's mainly this part of the brush that's touching the paper. I try not to let the tip touch, otherwise you'll get a sharp edge, which looks a bit strange. You know, if you look at the reference, there's no really straight line. So what I've created down here, lots of glitter here, a hint of a directional line through here without being too obvious, so that the eye moves into this part of the painting rather than moving out this way. Okay, so now let's do the next stage. And a hill is mostly a vertical shape. It's got some horizontal in it too, but because it's more of a vertical shape, lots of trees, so there'll be lots of shade underneath those trees, it's going to be darker in tone than the water. These boats are closer to us, and so they look darker in tone. So you've got to keep that in mind when we're trying to work out how dark should these hills be. I'm going to create this broken edge along the top because that's what gives you the trees. If you're painting landscapes, you'll tend to see a broken edge where there are trees, and if say the farmer has got rid of all the trees and it's just grass, then it would be represented with more of a sharp edge. We've got all this blue here. We can use it for the hill. I need more of that because I've almost run out of it. I'm going to mix some French ultramarine, a little bit of burnt sienna, some raw umber. The raw umber will give the mixture a slight greenish mix. And again, you see how dark that looks, but when we test it on paper, it really isn't very dark. So that tells me I have to add more paint to my mix. So more French ultramarine, more raw umber. I'm going to add a small amount of aureolin or Winsor lemon if you've got that, just to give it the tiniest hint of green. This one hill is lighter in tone, very light touch. As I said, I want to try and create a bit of a broken edge on that hill. Now we'll go into this hill. So I'm just getting some water out of the brush till I start seeing broken edge. That tells me there's not, you know, a lot of the water's come out of the brush. And I can break that up. But what I'm going to do to make it easier for myself, I'm going to just create a bit of a broken edge just by dabbing that edge there. Again, you don't want it to be too regular. And I just jiggle it a bit because I don't want it to look, you know, like the tiny little brush, vertical brush marks, as if you've given someone a crew cut or something like that. What I suggest you do, if you haven't used this before, just try it on a scrap piece of paper first. Good. That makes that a lot easier. Now, the only tricky part, there's a bit of light here. I'm going to paint around this shape. You have to get back in and paint along this top edge before that, or that sort of broken edge dries. This one's a bit darker. I managed to get to this stage without having to dry the paper, and it's still sitting quite flat, right? But if I twist this, you can see how it's still wet there. So I have to dry this now, because when I'm painting the boats, all the paint's going to bleed out, and I won't be able to paint the dark masks or any of that while that's wet. But I'm just going to try and just dry this section to try and leave as much moisture in the paper as I can. Boats, let's get some water. They're very small shapes. In fact, just French ultramarine and burnt sienna mainly. And that's good enough. Now for the mask, I need a very fine point. Normally a good brush will bounce back to a point, but when you don't have a lot of paint in it, it doesn't necessarily do that. So I'll just twirl it around the edge of my palette till I get a good point on it. Barely touching the paper. I wanted to get those vertical marks in just in case some of the moisture from underneath the paper comes through and softens the paint at the top. Now this boat's a little bit further away, so I'm going to just use slightly diluted paint. Get some thicker paint, and I'm going to give this a boom. I'll let that dry. I can't paint this boat, otherwise these two edges will just flow into one another. So I'll work on this boat here. So this is more of an underpainting stage here. I might just hit this with a hairdryer just for a second so I can work on this boat while this area is drying. And the main thing with the reflections, they've got to be directly below the object you're reflecting. So here's the mast. Put in some squiggles, and that sort of hints at the water, the ripples on the water. Like that. And then where the boat meets the water, you quite often have a darker passage there. It's hard to see in this case, but I like to add it anyway. So just mix up some French ultramarine and burnt sienna. Just run that along there. Darken that a bit. Then this boat will have a bit of a reflection. You don't always see the reflection all that well, but I like to put them in because they help break up open spaces like this. Then I'll darken this edge. But in this case, because the hull of the boat's already dry, just get a damp brush and just run it along there to help flow some of that paint up. Let's now move over to this other boat. And it's got a railing around it, so I'll just use my rigger for this. Just a hint at the railing. Now give this its reflection. And again, just some burnt sienna and French ultramarine, just at the water's edge. I'm going to try and time it so that the paint bleeds up and down, and that'll help connect it to the boat. Now I'm going to dry that, because where the windows are here, that should be a little bit darker than on either side of it. But because all this is wet at the moment, if I try and paint the windows, it'll just bleed into one shape. Just a very weak grey, that'll do. I'm not particularly happy with this colour, because if we look at our reference, the colour of the water, obviously it's reflecting a lot of this hill in the distance. Mine's not doing that. So at the moment I've got colour for the sky, colour for the hill, and then the water is a bit too warm. You can see some of the pinks coming through, okay? Now, the ideal time to have fixed that was just to have got it right in the first place. Now, I have to do a glaze over it to modify it so that it adds a bit more cohesion throughout the whole painting. So I'm going to wet the back of this because I need this to sit quite flat. So what I don't want to do is add any more pink into this. So I'm going to use these colours I've already got here. So a glaze is where you paint over another colour, the dry part of your painting. So you've got to make sure the underpainting is totally dry. Add a little bit more aureolin. This is where it's handy having some of these colours already on your paper that you've tested from before, because then you can test it here as to what the response is going to be like. I'm going to add a little bit more umber to this. Very light touch from in the distance, so I can try and preserve as much of the white paper. I'm happy with that. Just using this as an opportunity to add some more undulations in this area. These will be bigger as you come forward, and smaller in the distance. As I said, you try to avoid that, but sometimes you have to do it, and glazing is a very valid technique. All right, let me dry that. I'd like to thank all my Patreon supporters whose subscriptions help make these videos possible. And if you liked this video, please hit the like button, and if you haven't yet subscribed, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll be informed of every new video I produce. I look forward to seeing you for the next one.